The door clicked shut with a sound that Angela Brooks would never forget, not because it was loud, but because it was so quiet. Final, absolute. She stood on the front porch of the house she had painted, cleaned, decorated, and loved for over a decade, watching through the frosted glass panel as Marcus turned the deadbolt from the inside and walked away without looking back. He did not hesitate. He did not glance over his shoulder. He simply moved away from the door, the way you move away from something you have already decided to stop caring about, and his shadow grew smaller against the interior light until it disappeared entirely. He had the house. He had the silver SUV parked in the driveway that still had her gym bag in the trunk, still had the parking pass for her former office hanging from the rearview mirror, still held traces of a life he was apparently done pretending to share. He had the leather sectional she had picked out on a rainy Saturday afternoon years ago, the kitchen appliances she had researched for weeks before purchasing, the dining table around which they had shared hundreds of meals, some of them good, most of them in the later years strained by a silence that had grown too large to eat around. What Angela had was a suitcase, a tote bag, and $294 in her checking account. She was 38 years old, and the man she had spent 12 years building a life beside had just closed the door on everything they had shared without a single word of apology, without a glance backward, without even the basic human decency of saying goodbye. She stood there for a long moment in the cooling afternoon air, long enough for the light to change slightly, and for a neighbor's dog to bark somewhere down the block and fall silent. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of crying, instead of knocking, instead of doing any of the things that a decade of being gradually diminished might have predicted, Angela Brooks looked at that closed door, took a slow and deliberate breath, and made herself a quiet, unspoken promise. She did not know yet what that promise would cost her. She did not know what it would require, what it would build, or where it would eventually take her. She only knew, with the kind of certainty that lives not in the mind, but somewhere deeper, somewhere closer to the bone, that this door was not the end of her story. It was, against all appearances, the first page. The marriage to Marcus Brooks had not always been ugly. In the beginning, when Angela was 26 and working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm downtown, and Marcus was charming and confident, and seemed to see something in her that she was only beginning to see in herself, it had felt like exactly the life she had been quietly hoping for. He was ambitious. He liked nice things. He talked about the future with the kind of certainty that Angela, who had grown up in a household where money was always a whispered anxiety and opportunities were things that happened to other people, found deeply reassuring. They married after 2 years of dating, bought the house in their fifth year together, and for a while, the life they were building felt solid and real in the way that only the things you have genuinely worked for can feel. Angela was the steady one, the infrastructure of their shared existence, the person who made sure everything functioned. She managed the household finances with the same careful precision she brought to her clients' books. She kept the schedules, managed the bills, planned the dinners and the holidays and the social obligations, and she did it so competently and so consistently that it became, over time, entirely invisible. Marcus had become very good at not noticing the work that made his comfort possible. The coldness came gradually, the way most damage does not in a single dramatic fracture, but in a slow accumulation of small withdrawals. A conversation cut short, a weekend plan canceled without explanation, a tone that shifted from dismissive to contemptuous over months and then years, like a temperature that drops so incrementally you do not notice you are cold until you are shivering. He began to make comments about her career, her ambitions, her ability to manage on her own if circumstances ever required it. He said these things lightly, almost casually, in the way of someone who has learned to deliver cruelty with just enough plausible deniability to avoid full accountability. There was always a qualifier, always an escape hatch. I'm only saying this because I care, or I'm just being realistic, or the particular brand of belittlement that frames itself as concern. By the time Angela finally filed for divorce after years of trying and one devastating final betrayal she never spoke about publicly, she was exhausted in a way that went far beyond tired. She was hollowed out in the specific way of a person who has spent years pouring care and effort into something that was quietly draining away and did not realize until she finally looked at the bottom how much had been lost in the process. And then came the lawyers. Marcus had hired one of the better family law attorneys in the city, someone who knew exactly how to structure a settlement that looked equitable on paper while ensuring that the party with fewer financial resources walked away with far less than they deserved. Angela tried to match him. She spent 3 weeks making calls, sitting in consultations, collecting retainer quotes that were each, individually, more than she brought home in a month. In the end, she accepted a settlement that gave Marcus the house, the vehicle, and the bulk of their shared assets, in exchange for a single lump sum payment that was, by any honest accounting, insultingly small relative to everything she had contributed. She signed the papers on a Tuesday morning. Marcus signed them with a fountain pen he had clearly brought specifically for the occasion, the kind of small theater that told you everything you needed to know about who he believed he was in this story. His attorney shook his hand afterward. Angela's temporary counsel handed her a copy and told her to call if she had questions. On the drive back to a friend's apartment where she was staying, a text message arrived from Marcus. It read, "You were always going to struggle without me. I hope you prove me wrong, but I doubt it." She read it twice, put her phone face down on the passenger seat, and stared at the road. $294. That was what 12 years of her life had left her with. That, and a future that looked, from where she was standing, like a wall of fog with no visible horizon on either side. The weeks after the divorce were the hardest Angela Brooks had ever lived through, and she had lived through some hard things. She found a room to rent in a neighborhood she had always driven through rather than into a part of the city, where the houses were close together, and the streets smelled of other people's cooking, and the walls in her rented room were thin enough that she could hear her landlord's television through them each night, a low murmur that she eventually came to find, if not comforting, then at least less lonely than complete silence. The room cost $350 a month, which meant she was already running a deficit before she had bought a single bag of groceries. She sold things. A jewelry set Marcus had given her in the second year of their marriage went first not because she had any particular feeling about it, but because she was practical, and practicality was the only currency she had in real supply. A camera she had bought during a photography phase that never quite materialized. A small collection of books she had been carrying from apartment to apartment since her early 20s. A vintage lamp that had been one of her few genuine indulgences in the years before. She learned to confine herself to what Marcus approved of. Each transaction felt less like selling and more like dismantling, like taking apart some version of herself piece by piece and converting it into enough cash to reach the next week. She applied for every position she could find that matched her qualifications: bookkeeping roles, accounting assistant positions, office manager jobs at small businesses that needed someone organized and reliable and experienced. She had a solid resume, more than a decade of consistent professional experience, and references who spoke well of her. And yet the calls back were sparse. The interviews that came were too often followed by a silence that eventually hardened into a standard rejection email, and the few positions that did materialize offered salaries that would cover rent and utilities and almost nothing else. She was not naive about all of what was happening. She was a 38-year-old black woman with a resume gap and a rental address in a neighborhood that certain hiring managers read as a data point rather than a neighborhood. She did not spend much time in outrage about it. She filed it in the place where she stored the things she could not immediately change and kept moving, because moving was the only option that had any productive endpoint. One evening in late October, sitting on the edge of her bed with a calculator and a notepad and the particular kind of fluorescent overhead light that makes everything look more desperate than it is, she ran the numbers for the third time and arrived at the same answer she had arrived at the 2 previous times. She could not sustain this. The money was leaving faster than the jobs were arriving, and the jobs that were arriving would not close the gap. She sat in the thin light and felt, for the first time since the divorce, something that was not sadness or anger, but something quieter and in some ways more dangerous, the specific despair of a person who has done everything correctly and still cannot seem to find a way through. She called Denise Carter around 9 o'clock that night. Denise was her oldest friend, the kind of friend who had known her before Marcus, through Marcus, and now after Marcus, and who had never once said, "I told you so." Even in the moments when the words must have been sitting right there waiting, they talked for over an hour. At some point, the way real conversations between real friends sometimes do, they stopped talking about what was wrong and started remembering what was good. What kept coming up, what Denise kept returning to, with the insistence of someone who believes they are pointing at something important, was Angela's food. Everyone who had ever sat at Angela Brooks's table said the same thing, and they said it with the involuntary sincerity of people who are not commenting but reporting. The woman could cook in a way that transcended technique. It was not just skill, though she had that in abundance. It was something in how her food carried memory, the way a plate of her fried chicken tasted like a Sunday afternoon somewhere safe, like belonging, like being somewhere that was made for you specifically. Her collard greens made grown men go quiet. Her macaroni and cheese had been the subject of genuine arguments at family gatherings over who got the last serving. "You could actually do something with that," Denise said near the end of the call. "Like really build something." Angela didn't answer right away. She was looking at her phone, at a listing she had found earlier that day, and had been trying not to think about too seriously. A small trailer, battered and worn, a 15-year-old food cart with a rusted hitch, and a handmade sign that had partially peeled away from the weather, listed for $250 from a man in the eastern part of the city who needed to clear space in his driveway. $250. She had exactly 294. She bought it on a Thursday morning and regretted it for exactly 12 hours. The trailer was worse in person than it had appeared in the listing photos, which were blurry enough to have been optimistic or simply dishonest. One of the wheels had a slow leak. The serving window stuck and required a specific two-handed technique to open that the previous owner demonstrated patiently twice while Angela stood in his driveway and memorized the motion. The interior smelled of old grease and something sweetly chemical. She eventually traced to a cracked cleaning solution bottle wedged beneath the prep counter, and there was a section of the rear wall that had been patched with what appeared to be duct tape and good intentions. She spent the first night scrubbing it out with the focused, almost meditative intensity of a person who has decided that the only direction available is forward, and who is therefore making that direction as clean as possible before setting out. She had $44 left after the purchase. That was not enough to quit, and so she did not. She painted it herself over the following weekend, a warm cream color from a clearance bin at a hardware store, and the name she had been quietly turning over in her mind since Thursday morning: Brooks's Kitchen. She painted the letters freehand, which meant they were slightly uneven, and later she would say that the unevenness was the most honest branding decision she ever made because it looked exactly like what it was: something made by a person from scratch without a safety net. Her neighbor Gerald, a retired mechanic who lived 2 doors down and had watched the whole operation unfold with the careful interest of a man who doesn't want to get involved but finds that he cannot altogether look away, fixed the leaking wheel and tightened the hitch hardware in exchange for a home-cooked meal. Angela made him a plate of fried chicken with sweet potatoes and watched him eat it in the focused, concentrated way of someone taking something seriously. When he was done, he sat for a moment without speaking, and then said, with the deliberate gravity of a man who chooses his words before he releases them, "You can cook." Word had reached Marcus through the overlapping geography of mutual acquaintances, someone who knew Denise, or some similar route of secondhand information. His response, as it came back to Angela through Denise, was a short, derisive sound and a comment about how long it would last. He was not the only skeptic. Several people in her circle made the kind of cautious, concerned sounds that are really a form of doubt wearing the costume of care. Had she thought this through? Was she sure? Did she understand how many food businesses failed in the first year? What was her actual plan? Angela listened to all of it with the same expression: attentive, polite, utterly unperturbed. And then she went home and kept working. Her menu came together in the evenings. tested and tasted and refined over a 2 week period in the small kitchen of her rented room. Fried chicken prepared the way her grandmother had showed her, soaked overnight in seasoned buttermilk, dredged twice in a spiced flour mixture, fried in cast iron at a temperature she knew by the sound of the oil rather than a thermometer. Macaroni and cheese assembled in deep baking pans and finished until it had a crust on top that crackled satisfyingly when the serving spoon broke through. Collard greens braised low and slow with smoked turkey neck until they reached the particular tenderness and depth that could not be rushed. Cornbread baked in cast iron skillets so the edges came out crisped and dark. Sweet potato pie on Fridays, because Friday needed something sweet. These were not fashionable foods. They were not the kind of dishes that appeared in magazine profiles about innovative American cuisine. They were something older and more honest food that carried history and care in every element. Food that tasted like someone had made it specifically for the person receiving it, even if the two had never met before. She set up for the first time on a Saturday morning in early December, in a parking area adjacent to a community center on the east side that permitted vendor setups on weekends for a modest fee. She arrived at 5:30, before the sky had fully resolved from black to gray, and spent 2 hours prepping by the light of a battery-powered lantern clamped to the serving shelf. By 8 o'clock, she was open. By noon, she had served 14 customers. By 4 in the afternoon, when she packed everything down and drove the trailer back to her street, she had taken in $231 in cash. She sat in her car after parking and looked at the money and the handwritten tally in her notebook for a moment without saying anything. She had projected $60 on a reasonable day, maybe 80 on a good one. 231. She allowed herself one quiet exhale of something that felt, with appropriate caution and care, like the very early beginning of hope. The work that followed was the kind that does not photograph well and is not often described in the stories people tell about success after the fact. Angela was awake before 4 most mornings, not because she had decided to become an early riser, but because the operation required it. Greens started the night before needed checking. Chicken in its overnight brine needed to come out, be dredged, and be staged for frying at a consistent temperature. Mac and cheese had to be assembled and into the oven early enough to be ready at service time. Supplies had to be inventoried, anything running low had to be sourced, and everything had to be organized into a trailer with a fixed and finite amount of space in which there was no room for disorder. She worked every available weekend slot, and within 6 weeks had added a weekday lunch service at a parking area near a cluster of small businesses on the north side of the city, a spot where the foot traffic was reliable and the workers from the surrounding offices began, slowly and then more quickly, to treat her presence as a fixed point in their week. The regulars came gradually and then accumulated with the gentle momentum of genuinely good things. There was the woman from the insurance office who came every single Thursday and ordered the same thing and tipped more than was strictly required because, she once explained, she had decided that tipping well at places she loved was the most direct way she had to keep them in existence. There was the construction crew that discovered her parking spot on a Wednesday in January and returned the following 3 Wednesdays and eventually started calling ahead to make sure they had not missed her. There was the older man retired, Angela assumed, from the loose schedule of his appearances, who came 3 times before he told her, on the third visit, that her collard greens tasted exactly like his mother's used to. He had to stop speaking for a moment after he said it, and Angela handed him his plate and did not rush the silence. She knew these people's orders before they completed them. She learned their names and their habits, and, over time, the particular texture of their days, the ones when they came quickly and left quickly because they were busy, and the ones when they lingered at the window a moment longer than necessary, because what they were looking for was not entirely contained in a plate of food. Angela was not performing community. She was simply the kind of person who paid attention, and food turned out to be one of the most powerful instruments that kind of attention can find. In late January, a young woman who had been coming regularly began filming brief clips on her phone while she waited in line. The sound of chicken lowering into hot oil, the steam released when a pan of macaroni was uncovered, the exact moment when a cast iron skillet of cornbread was turned out and the crust caught the light. She posted them without ceremony, the way people do when something has genuinely delighted them and the delight wants an outlet. The reach was not immediate, but within 10 days, one of the clips had circulated widely enough to deliver a noticeable and distinct influx of new faces. People who mentioned the video when they ordered, people who had driven across the city, specifically because they had seen something on a screen and needed to verify it in person. Angela noticed, and she began to pay careful attention to what traveled and what did not. She placed a small handwritten sign in the window with that week's featured item. She stopped referring to the operation as the cart or the trailer in conversation and started calling it consistently by its name. The story that had attached itself to her, a woman who had lost nearly everything and started over from almost nothing, was one that resonated not because it was rare, but because, in some form or another, a great many people recognized it as their own. The blogger's name was Raymond Wells. He ran a moderately well followed food account, built over 3 years of genuinely knowledgeable local coverage that had quietly earned a reputation as one of the more reliable voices in the city for knowing where the real food was. He appeared at her Tuesday spot on a February afternoon without announcing himself, ordered 3 items with the focused deliberateness of a professional, ate them against his car in the parking lot, and then walked back to the window and ordered a fourth. Angela recognized none of this as significant until his piece posted 2 days later, a thorough, photograph heavy review, accompanied by prose that used words like transcendent and exactly the kind of cooking that reminds you what food is actually for. The morning after the post went up, Angela arrived at her Tuesday location to find a line that was already longer than any she had managed before. It kept growing. New customers arrived from neighborhoods outside her usual radius, from parts of the city she had never served. Catering inquiries began arriving through the contact information on her hastily constructed website. A neighborhood association reached out about their spring event. A small business cluster downtown asked about recurring weekly service. For the first time since she had signed those divorce papers and walked out of the lawyer's office holding a check that felt like an apology, Angela Brooks had more demand than she could supply on her own. She hired Tamara, a 19-year-old, who was fast and instinctive, and who learned Angela's systems the first time they were explained, and did not require supervision in the way that suggested she might eventually not need supervision at all. Even that smallest addition changed something that mattered. Having another person working beside her meant the operation was real enough to require help, which meant she was running a business, rather than simply surviving by other means. She paid off the last of her personal debts in March. She opened a dedicated business account in April and felt, when she signed the paperwork at the bank, a particular satisfaction in writing the name Brooks's Kitchen on the owner line. She moved into a slightly larger apartment, still modest, nothing that would have impressed anyone from her former life, but with a kitchen that actually functioned, and a bedroom where the walls belonged to her. Marcus had apparently come across her name through a repost of Raymond's review somewhere in his social media feed. He had not reached out, but word returned through Denise that mutual acquaintances described him as unusually quiet on the subject, in the particular way of someone who has something he wants to say and has decided, for reasons he is not ready to examine, not to say it. Angela, when she heard this, felt what she had not quite expected to feel. Nothing much in particular. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Simply the quiet recognition of a person who has stopped needing validation from the source that once chose to withhold it. She was too occupied for much else. In June, a producer from a local television news operation reached out through her website about a feature segment on local entrepreneurs. Angela hesitated genuinely, not performatively. Visibility of that kind felt different, more exposed, like an invitation to a form of vulnerability she was still calibrating. But the woman who had painted those letters freehand in a cold parking lot would not have declined something simply because it was frightening. And that woman was the one Angela was working every day to more fully become. She said yes. The segment aired on a Thursday evening and did exactly what a well-made piece of local television can do. It put a human face on a story that had been, until then, mostly moving through word of mouth and online clips, and it gave that story a reach and a weight that neither medium had quite managed. Angela was genuine on camera in a way that viewers respond to, not polished into someone unrecognizable, not performing ease, but present and real and thoughtful in a way that translated through the screen. The following morning, her phone did not stop, catering inquiries. A church on the south side about their annual summer event, a corporate account for weekly lunch service, a neighborhood festival, a permanent weekly slot at a farmer's market that had been trying to attract vendors like her for a season and a half. Each appearance generated more, in the way that visibility compounds once a story has found the audience it was made for. An investor named Daniel Hargrove approached her at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning in August, after standing in her line for 40 minutes without appearing to mind either the wait or the sun. He was not loud. He did not lead with his credentials. He asked specific, intelligent questions about operations and margins and sourcing, and he listened to the answers with the full attention of someone who is gathering information rather than waiting for a pause to talk about himself. He left her a card and told her, with what seemed like genuine sincerity, to take her time. Angela put the card in the pocket of her apron and spent 3 weeks thinking before she called him. Her hesitation was not about the opportunity itself. It was about what the opportunity represented, the possibility of entanglement, of allowing someone else's capital to create a claim on something she had built with nothing but her own effort and judgment. She had learned, at more personal cost than she cared to quantify, what it meant to have your choices shaped by another person's interests. She was not going to reproduce that lesson in a new context if she could avoid it. But Daniel Hargrove's proposal, when she finally sat across from him and heard it in full, was structured in a way that reflected an actual understanding of what she had built. Minority stake, capital for physical expansion, no operational involvement, no authority over the menu, the branding, the staffing, or the culture, full creative and directional control remaining entirely with her. She said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 more weeks. She said yes. The first permanent location of Brooks's Kitchen opened on a Saturday morning in October in a former sandwich shop on a busy commercial block that had decent bones and enough kitchen infrastructure to work from. The build-out took 6 weeks and tested Angela in ways that were different from but no less demanding than everything that had come before. There were permits that required follow-up calls, and then follow-up calls about the follow-up calls, the particular bureaucratic friction of a city that has systems for things and processes for the systems, and rarely makes either intuitive. There was a commercial hood installation that arrived incorrect and had to be reordered and reinstalled, costing a week she could not really afford. There were 3 separate conversations with the health department, each of which surfaced additional documentation requirements she had not previously known existed. There were days she arrived at 7 in the morning and left at 9 at night, and returned the next morning to a to-do list that had somehow grown longer in her absence. Through all of it, Tamara kept the food truck running its regular routes, which meant revenue kept flowing, while the construction consumed Angela's attention, a fact that, in her quieter moments, Angela recognized as evidence that the operation had become real enough to survive her being temporarily diverted from it. The night before the restaurant opened, Angela sat alone in the finished space after the last contractor had collected their tools and left. The tables were set. The kitchen was stocked and organized with the particular exactness of a person who knows that tomorrow will generate more chaos than any amount of pre-preparation can fully anticipate, and who is pre-preparing anyway. The sign above the door, Brooks's Kitchen, in the same slightly uneven lettering from the original trailer, now rendered professionally on a backlit architectural panel, was lit and visible from the street. She sat at a table near the front window and looked at what she had made. Not the furniture, or the kitchen equipment, or the signage, but the thing those represented the distance between a woman standing on a porch with $294 and a woman sitting in a restaurant that bore her name, that she had built with her own work from essentially nothing, that employed people and fed people, and was about to, tomorrow morning, open its doors to the public for the first time. She felt something she did not have a single precise word for. Not pride exactly, though pride was in it. Not relief, though relief was there too. Something older and quieter than either a recognition that the self she had been trying to recover since that afternoon on the porch had not simply been recovered. It had been rebuilt into something larger and more durable than what had existed before. The opening exceeded every expectation she had permitted herself to hold. The line on Saturday morning formed before she unlocked the door. By noon, the sweet potato pie was gone. By 2 in the afternoon, every table had turned over twice, and the kitchen was operating at a pace that Tamara later described as controlled chaos, with full emphasis on the chaos. The local newspaper ran a review the following week that was, without qualification, a rave. 2 regional food publications picked it up. The same producer who had done the original television segment called to ask about a follow-up piece. There were now 11 people on the payroll between the restaurant and the food truck. All of them paid competitive wages with health benefits because Angela had worked long enough in environments where those things were treated as optional to understand precisely what their absence costs. Marcus Brooks's fortunes had moved in a different direction. This was not something Angela tracked or dwelled on. She was genuinely too occupied with her own operations to spend meaningful time considering his. But the information arrived in fragments, the way it always does, when 2 people have spent 12 years building a shared social world that does not fully dissolve just because the marriage does. An acquaintance mentioned that the small real estate investment venture he had been running had encountered a sustained rough patch. Another mentioned that the house had been sold. A third mentioned, with the specific awkwardness of someone uncertain whether the news would be welcome or painful, or some combination of both, that Marcus had been asking after Angela. He called once, on a Tuesday evening in November, when Angela was at the restaurant, going over inventory numbers with Tamara. She let it go to voicemail. His message was brief and elaborately casual. He hoped she was doing well. He had heard things were going great for her. Maybe it would be good to catch up sometime. There was no apology in it. No acknowledgement of anything that had actually happened between them. It was the communication of a man who believed that time operated in his favor, and that the woman he had dismissed and discarded was still available to be re-engaged on his terms, when the terms happened to suit him. Angela listened to the message once, sitting in the parking lot after closing, and then deleted it and drove home. She was not angry. She had arrived at a place where the shape of Marcus Brooks simply no longer fit into the space she was occupying, and that was not a wound or a victory. It was simply a fact. He called once more in December, and that message she did not listen to at all. He did not call a third time. But he was, one January evening in the new year, watching television in the apartment he was renting after selling the house, when a segment began on a program he had not specifically tuned in to watch, and the face he saw stopped him completely. The national program was the kind of Sunday evening magazine show that runs on a major network, high production values, a reputation for stories that move people because they are genuinely true rather than sentimentally arranged. The producer had first contacted Angela's team 6 months earlier, and the process of making the piece had been thorough in the way that distinguishes serious journalism from flattering profiles. Multiple conversations, footage from the restaurant and the original food truck, interviews with customers, with Denise, with several of the women Angela had begun quietly mentoring through an entrepreneurship program she had joined the previous spring. The segment ran 14 minutes. It opened with Angela at the original food trailer, in the same parking lot near the community center where she had set up for the first time on that December Saturday morning 3 years earlier. She was standing at the serving window in her apron in the morning cold, and she was talking about what it had felt like to arrive in that spot for the first time with $44 and a wheel that was slowly losing air. She was at ease on camera, in a way she had not been during the local news piece, not polished into performance, but genuinely comfortable inside her own story, in the way of someone who has come to understand that the story belongs to her, and nobody else can take it or reshape it. The anchor asked about the beginning, about the settlement, the house, the door closing, the account balance that had dropped to almost nothing. Angela spoke about all of it, without drama or embellishment, which somehow made it feel more immediate than either would have the flat, factual recounting of someone who has processed the material so thoroughly that it no longer requires inflation to be heard. She spoke about the thin-walled room and the sold lamp, and the nights with the calculator that kept arriving at the same insufficient answer. She spoke about Denise's phone call and the listing for the trailer, and Gerald who fixed the wheel for a plate of chicken and said, with the gravity he brought to everything worth taking seriously, "You can cook." She spoke about the 4 a.m. mornings and the thin early margins and the customers whose names she learned and whose days she paid attention to and who became, over time, the human reason that the business kept meaning something beyond the income it generated. She spoke about Raymond Wells's review and the television segment and Daniel Hargrove's partnership offer and the night before the restaurant's first morning when she sat alone among the set tables and understood that she had not merely rebuilt what she had lost, but had built something entirely new. She spoke about the women she was now meeting with and mentoring women who were standing, in one form or another, exactly where she had stood on that porch, and what she told them, which was not a strategy or a formula, but a truth she had arrived at through experience. That beginning from nothing is frightening, and the fear is real, and they should feel it fully and then begin anyway. The anchor asked the question that the entire preceding 14 minutes had been building toward. What are you most proud of? And Angela Brooks paused just a moment, not for effect, but because she was genuinely thinking, and then said what she said. Not the money, not the restaurants. What she was most proud of was knowing that her value did not depend on anyone else's opinion of her. She had learned that the hard way, but she had learned it, and nobody could take it back. She smiled slightly after she said it, not at the camera, not at the host, at something or someone the lens did not quite capture, somewhere just outside the frame. In the apartment he was renting, Marcus Brooks did not move for a long time after the segment ended. He had told her she would never stand on her own. He had delivered this verdict with the ease of a man who believed it so completely that the utterance required almost no effort. It was simply fact, as he understood it, and facts did not require ceremony. He had been wrong in the most complete way it is possible to be wrong about a person. Not just about what she would accomplish, not just about the specific shape the future would take, but about the entire nature of the human being he had been describing. He sat with that in the quiet of a rented room, surrounded by furniture that was not chosen by either of them, and whatever he felt during those minutes was his own business and no one else's. There was no version of it that changed anything. Angela Brooks bought her house in March. Not the one she and Marcus had shared, not the one where a door had been closed in her face, but a different one. In a neighborhood she had admired for years, a house with a wide front porch. She had asked the realtor specifically about a kitchen large enough to actually work in, a yard with enough sun for a real garden she planned to build in the spring. She paid for it entirely herself. No cosigner, no financial entanglement, no one else's name on any document pertaining to it. She stood on the front porch on the afternoon she received the keys, in the clear March light, and held them for a long moment, without doing anything in particular. Not because she was performing the significance of the moment, but because she had learned through all of it, through the calendar of losses and recoveries and early mornings, and one very specific, quiet promise made on somebody else's porch to stop fully inside the moments that had been earned, to let them be what they were. The food truck operation had grown to 3 vehicles by then, each running established routes in different parts of the city, each staffed by people she had hired and trained, and in several cases personally guided through their own uncertainty about whether they were capable of the work. The restaurant had been joined by a second location across town, with a third in the planning stages. A publisher had approached her about a cookbook. A national food magazine had given her a full page. She had stood at a conference podium in front of 300 women entrepreneurs and talked for 40 minutes without notes and received a standing ovation that left her, for a moment after it began, visibly and privately undone. She was mentoring 7 women through the entrepreneurship program now, meeting with each of them individually every other week, reviewing their numbers and their plans and answering their questions, and occasionally simply sitting with them in the specific difficulty of starting something from a position where the resources are thin and the doubt is loud. She told them the truth, because she had found that the truth was more useful than any encouragement that required softening to be delivered. It was hard, and the hardness was real, and it was also possible, and the possibility was also real, and the only way to find out which one would win in your particular case was to begin. On a Wednesday afternoon in April, she drove the original food truck herself. She still did this sometimes, on days when she needed to remember something the restaurant could not quite give her, and parked it in the lot near the community center, where she had first set up in the dark and the cold on a Saturday morning that now felt simultaneously like yesterday and like another lifetime. She opened the serving window and started the equipment and stood in the particular smell and sound of the thing she had built from $44 and a rusted hitch and a very specific, very quiet, entirely private decision made on a porch that was never going to be hers again. The first customer in line was a woman who appeared to be around 30 and who had clearly been crying not very long ago and was making a visible effort to present as though she had not been. She ordered the fried chicken and the mac and cheese, and while Angela was assembling the plate, she asked, a little tentatively, if Angela was the woman from the television segment. Angela said yes. The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm at a really hard point right now. I just needed to see that it could actually work out. Angela handed the plate through the window. She looked at the woman for a moment, the way she had learned, over 3 years and hundreds of similar moments, to look at people when what they needed was to be seen, rather than simply processed, and said, It can. I promise you it can. And you are going to be okay. It was not a guarantee. Life does not traffic in guarantees, and Angela Brooks knew that better than most. But she also knew something she had not known on the afternoon a door clicked shut against her, that the distance between where you are and where you could be is not fixed, that the materials you begin with are not the measure of what you can build, that $294 in a decision and the absolute refusal to let someone else's opinion of you be the final word on your own life, that those things, it turned out, were enough, more than enough. They were, in the end, exactly everything.